Well, thanks everyone for joining in. Like I said before, this is Eating for All Day Energy, How Nutrition Can Nourish Women's Health. My name's Emma Gillath. I'm the marketing director at Kuli Kuli. We are a mission-driven company working to nourish the health of women and the planet using energizing superfoods. We're excited to be partnering today with UCAN on this topic of women's health and energy, because both our brands are really focused on how to provide clean energy sources to people who are looking to use food as medicine. And this is, for Kuli Kuli, this is something that's very interesting for us and exciting because we've really built our brand focusing on a superfood called moringa. And this plant is known around the world for all sorts of medicinal purposes. It's a plant protein, it's packed with iron, calcium, it's a natural and anti-inflammatory. But when we recently did some consumer insight studies, we learned that the real reason that most people are eating this is because they feel this natural energy boost. And this is something that's not from caffeine, it's a feeling of uplifting energy that they're feeling. And so this has been a new kind of area of how we've been talking about moringa, and we're excited to just be learning from other experts in the field about just food in general and how women in particular who are facing so much right now, particularly at this time during this pandemic, often working the double shift even more than usual, how we can maintain our energy and not just lean into kind of traditional caffeine or other sorts of ways to kind of cope through, how we can really use food to get us through this. So I want to pass it over to Peter Kaufman. He's the Chief Inspiration Officer and founder at UCAN to tell us a little bit about UCAN.
Hi, everyone. I hope everyone is continuing to stay healthy and doing as well as possible despite these very difficult circumstances. I'd like to welcome you on behalf of UCAN to the first joint Kuli Kuli UCAN webinar. So I am Peter Kaufman. I'm one of the founders of the UCAN company, and I would like to say how pleased we are to bring this webinar to you along with our good friends from Kuli Kuli. Women's health issues to you is because we together can offer a very unique set of nutritional solutions with important benefits for you in combination with really interesting content not easily obtainable elsewhere. UCAN's nutritional solution is based on a new, completely natural, all our products are foods, none are supplements, carbohydrate that we've originally developed only to help children with a very rare blood sugar disease stay alive. It's now the best kept secret in pro and college sports, as well as the endurance world of running, cycling, and triathlon. But it's also helped tens of thousands of individuals at a very prominent gym chain in the US to lose weight, and it has very important implications for helping anyone looking to improve their metabolic health, which should be virtually all of us, especially now. UCAN Superstarch is scientifically based, it's field proven, and therefore it's attracted the attention of many important scientists and researchers, as well as top nutritionists and coaches in the world of professional Olympic sports. Both our companies have in fact attracted wonderful science and research experts, and we're so pleased that we can bring a couple of those experts to you today, along with an additional expert in the food world to moderate today's discussions. I will leave it to Elizabeth to introduce herself, as well as our panelists. I think you're going to find this discussion very timely and extremely helpful, and I hope you'll enjoy it fully, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Peter. I just wanted to take a moment to introduce our moderator for today. This is Elizabeth Crawford. She is the Deputy Editor of Food Navigator, and she covers a range of regulatory and business issues in our food system, ranging from innovation, biodiversity, marketing, sustainability, and so much more. She's an incredible writer and covering just a lot of the most pressing issues right now in our food system. But she also runs an amazing podcast called Soup to Nuts, and she's done some work on Kuli Kuli in the past, and it's always a really interesting podcast with tons of amazing interviews. So thank you, Elizabeth, for leading our panel today.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be here today. Talk a little bit more about how nutrition can nourish women's health and provide energy necessary to get through the day. Sort of as May mentioned, this topic is particularly important right now for everybody, given the stress of the pandemic, but especially women who, again, as May pointed out, are sort of pulling this double shift of at the professional level, either their industries have been hit hardest and they're worried about the economy and their finances if they're laid off, or if they're still going to work, exposure to the virus, and then having to come home or work from home while their kids also go to school and need snacks. And there's just a lot to deal with right now. So I think that's important to note, but I think it's also important to put the pandemic and women's expectations in a greater context. I mean, even before the pandemic, women faced pressure to do it all, which is not only unattainable, but exhausting. So I'm really excited today to talk about how nutrition and the addition of some common and maybe not so common ingredients can fuel women as they balance or dodge, whatever is thrown at them. So specifically today, we'll take a closer look at the connection between nutrition, health, and immunity, explore how slowing down rather than always rushing may more effectively give women the sustained energy they need to achieve their goals. We'll also consider the connection between inflammation, energy, and diet. And finally, hopefully, bust a few myths about how the diet impacts women's energy and overall health. So we have a lot to cover. And to help us tackle these issues, I'm honored to be joined by two esteemed experts. With me today are Dr. Catherine Yeckel, who's the Assistant Professor of Clinical Public Health at Yale School of Public Health. She has a PhD in Preventive Medicine and Community Health Nutrition and a Master of Science in Exercise Physiology and Metabolism. Her research and teaching center around the integration of exercise, nutrition, and metabolism for health. Also with us are Dr. Kancha Koya, who is the founder of Spice Baby, which brings together science-based benefits of spices to use in family-friendly recipes that are simple and delicious. As a food medicine practitioner and health coach, Dr. Koya also relies on her doctorate in molecular biology at Harvard Medical School and her training at the Institute of Integrative Nutrition to elevate the health of families with science and flavor. Before we jump in, I want to encourage listeners to please submit your questions in the Q&A box as you think of them, and I'll do my best to weave those in as we go along or save them for the last few minutes at the end and answer as many as we can as time allows. You can also chat with each other using the chat box that Emma pointed out, but again, if you have a question, please do put that in the Q&A box, because as we covered, women can't do everything, and I can only look at the Q&A box and not the chat box. So that's the best way to reach me. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. Dr. Koya, maybe you can kick off our conversation by telling us a little bit more about what it means to be a food as medicine practitioner and the role that food can play in promoting wellness and healing the body.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm so honored to be here with all of you, and really, really excited to be talking about this incredibly important topic, especially now as we are being forced to kind of wake up and pay attention to our underlying health in the face of, this new virus and these challenges. So, I mean, the idea of food as medicine is as ancient as we are. Our ancestors relied on food as medicine, and a lot of those ancient claims and a lot of that ancient wisdom is now being validated by modern medical research. So I see my place as really trying to help people leverage the science as it's emerging in actionable ways in their own kitchens. I'm a huge foodie at heart, and I really believe that we eat, 3 times a day, sometimes more, sometimes less, but we have so much power in terms of what we put into our bodies, in terms of, really nourishing us, or on the flip side, causing some unwanted damage. So I think leveraging what we understand about some of the micronutrients, some of the phytonutrients or plant-based nutrients, like in moringa, for example, and really leveraging that in a very actionable and feasible and delicious way, I think can be very powerful, and that's kind of where my passion lies.
Fantastic. And Dr. Yeckel, you also focus heavily sort of on the impact of nutrition on health. Given the current situation of the world and sort of our collective focus on health and immunity, what's your take on using food as medicine? Where do you see the risks around diet and health, and also the most potential for food to either heal or help maintain wellness.
Yeah, it's wonderful to be here. I also am very passionate about this sort of intersection of health and food and metabolism. For the listeners out there, I really do come more from the metabolism side and sort of try to look at that interface. So to me, I also, when we think about this COVID epidemic, the pandemic, and think about what do we know about metabolism and where are the recommendations for sort of first health and immunity, you know, we think about it from, okay, we've known for a very long time that malnutrition, undernutrition is just a really bad thing for immunity. Our immune systems need so many different components. And right now, the recommendation for the balanced diet, actually, you know, we kind of dismiss it, but it's actually quite good, because when you think about it, we need protein, we need omega-3 fatty acids, we need these plant nutrition pieces, the phytonutrients, the polyphenols, all these, the flavonoids, everything that can kind of create these sort of antioxidant potential and give us, you know, these vitamin C and vitamin A and zinc and micronutrients that all work together to really support a foundation and bolster our whole resilience in terms of the immune system. So from the side of sort of where we are in COVID, we don't necessarily know exactly what we should be eat. Like there isn't necessarily one piece that we can hone in on and say, yes, people thought, yes, we needed vitamin D. Well, that, you know, that may be true in a balanced way, but it's not necessarily a risk where you go out and you end up, you know, super compensating and taking mega supplements. So I think that one of the biggest risks, one of the cool things is we don't have medicine to do this. We don't have medicine to just sort of bolster our immune system. Instead, we have all this incredible rich food sources that we can be using to bolster our immune systems. And then at the same time, we have to counter that with sort of that risk potential of every headline that comes out in the news. We have to sort of worry, like, are people going to go nuts in one direction and say, okay, I'm going to take mega supplements of vitamin D or vitamin A or something that actually could backfire and hurt our immune system or hurt our immune response. So, you know, we have this sort of this wonderful potential that's starting to get people interested in nutrition and health, but we also have this risk side that everyone wants kind of the magic bullet and so I think we have to really, and I think particularly with women, we can start to educate them and help them realize that we have this whole spectrum of foods and ingredients that can start to nourish us. To give a great example though, because I also look at it from where is our disease profile right now, and so many people have obesity, type 2 diabetes, cardiometabolic problems, and that all with, you know, so much of that is associated with inflammation, this low-grade inflammation, CRP as a C-reactive protein, as sort of that backdrop, that sort of marker that tells us where inflammation is. Well, we know that we can actually encourage people to eat in these head-to-head diets where they've kept the carbohydrates steady, but we've done low glycemic, low load versus high glycemic, high load types of events, diets. We can see that we can promote a drop in that CRP that's actually fairly equivalent to a statin medication. So talking about as food as medicine, we actually have individual examples where the food, the complex richness of our food could be a real solution to even help this background inflammation that puts us so at risk for COVID problems. That's where I would start.
And I think that's a great start. And I like what you said there, sort of about people looking to food for solutions. I think on the business side, we've certainly seen that. We've seen sales of products, really any kind of product, making immunity claims flying off the shelf, especially during those frantic pantry loading days. But one of the things that I would be interested to hear from both of you on, and talking with your patients or the people you interact with, Spice Baby, you know, to what extent does the mainstream consumer or person not in the health or the food field understand the benefits of nutrition and its relation to health? I mean, is it just, do they just know about vitamin D and vitamin C, or where are we at in that education landscape? Dr. Koya, do you want to go first, since maybe you interact sort of with the average bear a little bit on your website?
Yeah, definitely. I'm very active on social media and very passionate about educating the layperson to make more informed decisions and think about these things in a more nuanced way. I mean, to echo what Dr. Yeckel said, I think there is this trend of looking for magic bullets. People forget that the whole picture is incredibly important. And if you're eating the standard American diet and then trying to throw in an occasional supplement or a powder or a shot of something that is beneficial, you know, it's arguable whether that will really have the effect that you hope it will. In contrast to fixing the backdrop, if you will, with some really simple things. Again, like Dr. Yeckel said, you know, the recommendations that we have, they don't seem so trendy or hot or like super exciting. They're back to the basics, but they're really, really powerful once they're implemented. And so I think the message that I find myself reiterating with my audience is, let's go back to the basics. Let's look at combinations of population studies, molecular studies, animal studies, lab studies, you know, and let's kind of come up with a very simple blueprint for how we should eat to start. And once we have that in place, then yes, we can think about increasing the amount of certain superfoods or being very strategic about what you put in your smoothie, for example, you know, and leveraging some of these properties where the science is really compelling. But I do see this unfortunate trend where there's a lot of emphasis on the magic bullet and the superfood and ignoring kind of the backdrop of the diet that we should all be focusing on. And then the second thing I hope we'll get to some of that in the myth busting is, I really do unfortunately sense a lot of diet wars out there. So there's so many labels, unfortunately, now in terms of what is your preferred way of eating, you know, low carb, high carb, keto, gosh, I can go on and on, vegan, you know, and it's unfortunately kind of misses the woods for the trees. You know, yes, there are nuanced differences in outcomes based on some of these choices, but ultimately we know what the common denominators are of the world's healthiest diets, and they transcend labels. And I think if we can just get back to some of those principles, we can really start to see more powerful shifts. So those would be a couple of the trends that I'm trying to work to, you know, educate people out of.
Thank you. Dr. Yeckel, is there anything that you wanted to add sort of with where we're at in the education and where we should focus as a first step?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question, because I don't think people are very educated. I think that we, in the nutrition space, I think there's been this huge focus on weight loss and weight control, which means everybody has been sort of focused on these types of diets, but really with the end result of being a weight control function, and missing all the beauty that all of these wonderful foods, that sort of everything that's colorful in the diet, that brings to the diet, and the fact that the more colorful it is, the likelihood that it has more nutrition for you. So one of the things that I always try to impress on people, including kids, is I think color is one of the components that resonates with people, including kids. Kids will tell you what they ate that was red yesterday. You know, people remember color for whatever reason. And I think it's wonderful, because I think it's one of the few things that can maybe help people move ahead. It's like, well, what have you eaten? Have you eaten all your colors today? I mean, it's something really, it seems kind of silly, but it's what will people remember, and what will they actually gravitate toward? Because when you open this up, Elizabeth, and said how much people are consuming these processed foods, and you know, and part of it is long shelf life. They don't want to go to the store. There's food insecurity. What's cheap? What can I get in bulk? What can I get because it's on the shelf that my kids will be calm for a while? But it all works against us, because we also know that all of those health. So they're moving us in the wrong direction. But yeah, I think there's a lot of, I think this is a fantastic opportunity for educating women and families and everyone about more the richness of nutrition. This is one of the first opportunities we have that isn't really about weight control, right? And in fact, so much of metabolic health can happen at any weight. And so and improving your health can happen at any weight. So that's where I come from.
I appreciate that. And I like what you said about a lot of people taking steps they think are beneficial and maybe create sort of a short-term answer that they like, but don't help so much in the long term. And when we were chatting the other day, you mentioned this idea. I mean, I hope I'm not the only one who's guilty of being tired and sluggish and having a cup of coffee after 3 p.m., even though I know that I shouldn't, because there's just so much pressure to rush and rush and rush and go all the time. But the other day, Dr. Yelko, you mentioned that women might actually do better if we slowed down a little bit and looked at sustained energy. So I'm wondering if you can sort of talk a little bit about the benefits of taking a few extra beats to select and consume foods that have maybe not that immediate effect, but will carry people through for the next 6 hours.
Yeah, I think this is so fundamental, and particularly now. And I think for women, we just don't have all these extra calories that we have. Just men can spend a lot more extra calories than women can. So we really need to make smart choices. And, you know, we can take a slow approach. I think even just sitting down, plating out the food, taking a breath, and really just even taking that breath shifts the brain from that stress fast lane to the parasympathetic rest digest slow lane, right? So it automatically starts a better digestive process. We know that food, even if you eat the same food and you eat it over, 40 minutes versus 10 minutes, you have the benefits. You can expend more calories even from that meal. It starts to pattern the metabolism. But then the real fundamental thing for me is starting to think about the choices. And there's some really interesting research around the fact that if you can start even with, again, the same foods, but the order that you choose those foods, so that if you're taking something that has a lot of water content initially and has all the antioxidants in it, and then move on to your protein, and then last think about the carbohydrates, hopefully the complex carbohydrates, right, and the fiber, that you can actually slow gastric emptying. You can extend your energy. You can help your metabolism not have a tsunami of nutrients thrown at it, but instead it can go along a more patterned, more civil pace, just as you are going through a civil pace of eating it. So even just the fundamental changes in order, so that right now the consensus is carbohydrate last, so don't do the bread basket, nuts, maybe something like that in the initial part, but think about that toward the end. But then there's also the whole beauty about products like moringa products, the super starches and all of these sort of low glycemic index promoting types of foods, that they are designed. The whole reason superstarch even exists is to help people that have glycogen storage, that can't produce their own blood sugar. So the idea that you can have a time release and a slowdown, and the whole principle behind the low glycemic index, if people don't know, although it's very confusing, it's not the perfect thing, but it's the idea that you don't have this deluge of sugar hit your blood system, right? Your circulatory system, that you slowly add it. Well, products like moringa can help with that. Products like the super starch can actually be great tools, because you know, the super starch is designed to have this time release slow access. But lentils and whole grains and quinoa, and there's all these rich foods that's the whole intent, right? They slow, they don't just throw all the sugar off right at the beginning of the intestine. They last, they persevere, they can get down, you know, hopefully a lot of them can get down to the colon and support our microbiome. So I think the slowness, we've forgotten about that. So much of our processed food is being digested and absorbed away at the top of our whole gastrointestinal tract. We've forgotten that we have a whole nother layer and importance. We need to feed our microbiome healthy ingredients.
And it is fun to sort of start to see that seep out and people learning about their microbiome. So I appreciate the examples that you provided of not just the order that we should eat food, although I'm not sure that I liked hearing about the breadbasket since that's my favorite part. But Dr. Koya, I want to pull you in here because I know that you do a lot of work with spices, obviously. So I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit about what foods or spices can help moderate blood sugar and help do exactly what we're talking about here, which is slow and sustained energy.
Yeah, I love that you brought that up. I think we all need a reminder to slow down, whether it's in the preparation of our food or whether it's in the consumption of it, the way we sit down and eat it, the amount of times we chew it, which is all part of the digestive process and allows for optimal absorption of those micronutrients and, you know, energy as a consequence of that. So I think it's just such a wonderful and under discussed topic. So when it comes to blood sugar control, yes, there are a couple of spices where the science is emerging and very, very interesting. The one most people might be familiar with is cinnamon. So there's been some recent studies looking at the ability of cinnamon to help diabetics reduce or get off their medications. There's been other studies looking at just blood glucose levels in response to cinnamon versus not, or blood glucose spikes. So I think cinnamon is a really interesting spice to think about. You know, the good news is you can achieve, it seems, based on these small human studies, meaningful amounts of cinnamon just through diet alone. So half a teaspoon to 1 teaspoon a day seems to be sufficient to give you some sort of effect in terms of readout in like 3 months, for example. I always tell people if you're using cinnamon regularly to balance blood sugar, and the mechanism behind that is thought to be improved insulin sensitivity and insulin function. You really want to go out of your way to buy or procure what we call true cinnamon, also called Ceylon cinnamon or cinnamon verum. So there are 2 kinds of cinnamon on planet Earth. One is the one that we routinely find on grocery store shelves. It's called cassia cinnamon. You might also just see it as cinnamon alone, or sometimes Vietnamese or Saigon cinnamon. It's a wonderful cinnamon. It's very rich and peppery. We, you know, associate it with the holidays. It's wonderful in curry, which is something I'm, you know, obsessed with. But the research shows us that cassia cinnamon has measurable amounts of a compound called coumarin, which at high enough doses can be a liver toxin. And actually in Scandinavian children who eat cinnamon regularly with their porridge, their blood tests showed high enough levels of coumarin that were concerning. So if you are using cinnamon to balance blood sugar and for that slower energy release, go out of your way to find true or Ceylon cinnamon. That's one tip. And then the second spice that I think people are a little bit unfamiliar with, maybe in the West, is coriander seed. So it's the same plant as cilantro. Cilantro and coriander both come from the same plant. The seed has kind of lemony and peppery notes. And it's usually used in curry blends, but it's very, very versatile. You can sprinkle it on salads. You can put it in your eggs. You could put it on roast vegetables. Really, the sky is the limit. And there's some interesting research around coriander and diabetes control and blood sugar management as well. You know, and then going back to what we were talking about earlier and the role of this kind of chronic low-grade inflammation, which we know there's this constellation of factors when it comes to chronic inflammation, insulin resistance, you know, and metabolic dysfunction. And so when we're thinking about inflammation, really the spices shine. There is so much evidence around so many of them. in terms of how they affect inflammation at different kind of molecular points in the pathways. So for instance, we all know turmeric, it's the sort of golden poster child for good reason. Curcumin is the active compound, although there are probably other bioactives as yet undiscovered, unstudied. So turmeric has this ability to block a transcription factor that we call NF-kappa B, which is really this master orchestrator in the cascade of inflammation. And then we know that sumac, which is another Middle Eastern spice, also has antioxidant, anti-inflammatory capabilities. Cayenne pepper, paprika have capsaicin, which also block inflammation in different ways. Black pepper, nutmeg. So there's a host of spices that can help balance blood sugar directly, but also the spices that target kind of this low-grade inflammation that we really want to pay attention to when it comes to metabolic health, women's health, energy, and overall health.
So just so that we're all on the same page, because I think that you raise an interesting point with the inflammation, but can you take us back a couple of steps and just explain sort of the connection between inflammation and exhaustion?
Yeah, so, there is this idea, like we know from a lot of different studies that, well, I guess if we really take a step back, we don't want to villainize inflammation. It's a very, very important part of our defenses, right? Against incoming pathogens, against dysregulated cells, abnormal cells. So we need inflammation. The problem is we don't want it on all the time. We want it to do its thing in the right place, in the right context, and then we want it to go back to baseline. And now, unfortunately, because of a confluence of factors, including diet, lifestyle, toxins in our environment, food supply, stress, lack of sleep, on and on, too much alcohol, many of us are walking around in a chronically hyper-inflamed state. So this is that sort of low-grade wildfire that's just, always there in the background. And it's an energy sink. It takes energy for your body to be constantly ramping up pro-inflammatory molecules and pathways, which are really meant to be more of like sort of a precise action when needed and shut off when not. So this idea that chronic inflammation may be an energy sink and maybe contributing to low energy and exhaustion, I think is really important to think about. And then we can start to think about all the anti-inflammatory tools, whether it's diet, lifestyle, spices, moringa, all those wonderful things, to really be very strategic about how we manage that.
Dr. Jekyll, I want to pull you in here. So we have some great examples of spices and individual ingredients, but you mentioned earlier that women in particular, but all Americans right now seem very diet obsessed, and there are a lot to choose from. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how certain diets, we hear a lot about keto, and like you mentioned earlier, is sort of the focus on weight, but it's also created for other reasons. So I'm wondering if you talk about how diets like keto or exercise like HIIT might impact the function of sort of the mitochondria and energy levels and help keep that up.
Yeah, that's a really good question, because there hasn't actually been that much done, particularly with muscle, from a ketogenic diet and how that's really impacting mitochondrial function. We know that fat oxidation can get bolstered, but what about content? What about function? But exercise, oh my gosh, obesity, type 2 diabetes, aging, all of these conditions where mitochondria can start to be quite stressed and can fall out of the picture. Exercise is preventive, is reestablishing, it's nourishing to the mitochondria for that matter. So we know that the exercise training, whether it be HIIT or aerobic exercise, and oftentimes, one of the big ideas initially was that, oh no, HIIT can't possibly do all the same things as regular aerobic endurance training, and it's actually pretty good at doing a lot of it. And so we don't need to think of doing one kind of exercise. In fact, I would suggest do all sorts of different kinds of exercise training, do endurance, do HIIT, but these together have real potential to not only increase mitochondrial content, but capillarization and the idea that the function of the mitochondria become more efficient, right? And there's some inklings in the literature that we'll see that with something like a keto diet, but the literature in human just isn't there yet. So although we know at a whole body level there's higher fat oxidation, so we know that clearly the mitochondria are becoming more efficient at burning fat. We don't actually know structurally and content and all the ins and outs based on any, as far as I'm aware of, particularly any kind of diet specifically, that exercises really reign supreme. We do know, however, that just because you undergo weight loss and improve insulin sensitivity, that does not necessarily, there hasn't been any convincing work that has suggested in obesity, type 2 diabetes, aging, that improves mitochondrial content or function. So again, it seems to be very specific to the exercise, not so sort of the weight loss that is taking the burden off of these insulin resistance pieces with muscle.
Since you sort of brought up the need to be specific about different diets and different exercises and their impact, I'm going to bring in a very specific question from the audience, which I think is timely. Obviously, we're talking about women's health today, but our attendee wants to know if there's really a substantial difference between male and female in sort of the foundational metabolic pillars of good health, as opposed to focusing on common disease states or diets or exercises.
Is this directed toward me or to Koya?
It's to both of you.
Dr. Koya, sorry.
So
Pancham, do you want to start?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I saw it pop up in the chat box. I think you're probably better equipped to answer it, Dr. Yackel, but there is one thing I will say, which we haven't really talked about, but I think when we're thinking about mitochondrial function and we're thinking about enhancing that, and we know that it dwindles with age dramatically. And, I think something that people talk a lot about now is the power of these hormetic stressors, whether it's exercise, whether it's some of these superfoods, and also something like intermittent fasting, for example. And I think, something that came to mind when I saw that question was different responses to fasting between men and women. I think the field is still catching up to that question, but I think there is some evidence that women may respond differently to things like intermittent fasting or alternate day fasting in terms of, say, their insulin sensitivity or improved metabolic health. And so I guess I don't know the exact answer to what the research says and where the data is, but I wouldn't be surprised if there are differences in the way women and men respond to some of these hormetic stressors and consequently sort of enhanced, improved mitochondrial function, for example, between genders. And I think fasting may be something where people are starting to tease that apart and really notice some differences between men and women.
Yeah, from my part, to answer that question, I think, there haven't been as many biopsy studies done in women oftentimes they're usually associated with exercise studies, and there hasn't been as much work done. One of the things that we know that's quite distinct when it comes to, and so if you think about exercise as sort of that magnified metabolism, let's bring all the cards to the table. Women are really good at fat oxidation, and particularly during exercise. So what gets in the way is actually if you suck back some fast carb, some simple sugars, because all of a sudden then you're just like the guys. you all of a sudden are you have to use those simple carbohydrates. But if you allow blood sugar just to be stable, like with UCAN, and you have the ability to have this range of intensities. We know that women can get to a higher intensity and still burn more fat. We know that we have just better capacity, and that's our secret weapon, really. It really is pretty amazing. So I would, it's harder to tease apart things with fasting, but it's much easier to amplify and to change things up when you exercise and see where that's going. I've always been impressed that you could take women and that were already pretty active and then do hit types of exercise and increase fat oxidation even more. So it really, we have that. If there's anything we're really good at, of course we have more fat stores, right? But we're also very good at it. And part of the reason probably why we have more is because we really do need to move to burn, to mobilize those fat stores and to burn them. So we're very efficient when it comes to going right back down to our resting metabolic rate, whereas men will have this fat burn for hours afterwards. We okay, we're back to rest. So it can be very difficult, but that's one huge difference, I think, between that's been consistent in the literature over time. And it doesn't, but you can disrupt that very quickly depending on if you've eaten something. We know that this is a great example for nutrition and all day. If you've eaten something, they've done a study where it's like eat muesli versus like cornflakes in the morning, right? And exercise at lunchtime. So hours later, the people who ate muesli can burn more fat. The metabolism has come back down. The insulin has ceased to be such a problem in terms of inhibiting the fat mobilization. So you have the fatty acids to use. So resting, walking, running, all can have amplified fat oxidation just from the simple change at breakfast time.
So I guess one more reason to stick to my oatmeal every morning. I want to thank you both for addressing that question, and also just in general bringing such a high level of science to our conversation, because there's a lot of information out there that is not as rigorous as what I think you all are bringing to the table. And it can be hard to distinguish fact from fiction. And so I'm hoping we can actually take a few minutes to address some of these big myths that we hear around nutrition and health and energy, and in particular, how they relate to women. I think we've already touched on this a little bit, but one of the first big myths that I'm hoping we can address around diet and energy is around carbs, right? So are they a good source of fuel? Do they contribute to fogginess and sluggishness? Should we cycle them? Should we drop them entirely? Should we just eat the breadbasket? Maybe Dr. Yeckel, do you want to start this off and sort of let us know where we really stand on carbs?
Yeah, I don't think we should vilify them. I think we need to be smart about them. I think that simple sugars, I mean, we just have way too much in our diet. So I don't see a whole, sure, you can have a dessert now and again. I'm not saying that we shouldn't, this is about sustained nutrition across a lifetime. But in general, and for women, again, we don't have a lot of excess calories just to suck back simple sugars. And simple sugars, a drink that's basically just sugar, that hits the system very hard, very fast, to a high degree. It requires a huge insulin response, which a lot of us can't mount, or we can mount it and we mount it like the kids with obesity. It's such a problem because they have sky high insulins when they have that little bit of sugar. And so it's a huge burden on the pancreas. So if we can take that away by using slow carbs, by losing that are essentially smart carbs, right? These complex carbohydrates, the fibers that start to they're able to sort of transit longer in the digestive tract, like the superstarch, which is basically lovely time-release glucose. And studies that have been done with slowly digesting starches like superstarch with fancy tracers have shown that comes off just in the right amount for what the liver, to balance what you need for your steady blood sugar. And superstarch, as far as I know, it still reigns supreme in terms of the hours that, because of who it was designed for. So the hours of sustained energy and smooth energy. So it's really quite striking when you can take the burden off, because it can slip under metabolism and allow your body to do everything it needs to do. It doesn't have to say, okay, hold on, wait, everything's coming in now. We've got a sugar wave coming. So it's a big difference between simple, which is going to cause a tsunami, and complex and slow digesting starches and carbs that really can just almost slip undetected, and so that don't need a lot of insulin to react.
Fantastic. And so sort of building on that, we have an interesting question. We've already talked a bit about exercise and sort of the foods that we can consume to sort of fuel our workout. But obviously not every woman needs to burn fat, as many of us have been told throughout our lifetime. So I'm wondering, when we think about nutrition, what other elements should we focus on beyond sort of this fit look?
Do you want to? Yeah, sure. I'll kind of pick up where Dr. Yeckel left off. I mean, gosh, I love that you talked about how so many people are so obsessed with a certain weight and with weight loss. And of course, like, there's a lot of people walking around with excess weight, and we know that that doesn't contribute to long-term, positive health. So getting in a healthy weight range is important, but we also know that that's not the be all and the end all, and you can actually be quite unhealthy and at the right weight. So when I think when we're thinking about long-term health and nutrition, we cannot ignore the importance of our microbiome. Dr. Yeckel talked about that, but just going back to this myth busting around carbs, the trillions of bacteria that we harbor in our gut thrive on complex carbohydrates and on fiber that is derived from these complex carbs. So when I see some of the diet wars out there where people have completely eliminated some of these microbiome nourishing foods like legumes, lentils, whole grains, which are, systematically associated with longevity and positive health, it kind of breaks my heart. And I really want to drive home this message that we cannot, in the quest for sort of band-aid solutions and just weight loss, starve these microbes, because it turns out that these microbes, once they are nourished and fed well with these plant-based starches and foods and fibers, will produce molecules like short-chain fatty acids, like butyrate, for example, which will travel to your brain and directly impact mood, brain health. They will travel systemically and impact things like inflammation. They will balance your satiety and hunger hormones so that you're more satisfied, less kind of craving the junk. So the importance of microbiome health, I think, is really, really critical to keep in mind when we're thinking about nutrition and long-term health and some of these myths around, all carbs are bad.
Wonderful. Thanks for bringing that up. I want to sort of stick with you, Dr. Koi, if you don't mind, because I think in addition to being bombarded about messaging around weight maintenance and diet in that regard, women are also bombarded about messaging about how our life cycles and our monthly cycle might influence our health and our energy levels. So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about how women might need to moderate or tweak their diet as they go through the month to maintain that energy or to fight off insomnia, and how that might even change through their life cycles as they go older.
Yeah, so the work around the monthly cycle is really based on some incredible research and books by Alisa Vitti, who has written Flow Living, In the Flow. She's the founder of Flow Living, and she really focuses on this infradian rhythm that we all women share. It changes through the month, and I think we don't appreciate it enough. We don't necessarily tap into the differential needs of our bodies, even when it comes to caloric need, for example, as we traverse this monthly cycle. So for example, we know that in the luteal phase, or the 2 weeks leading up to menstruation, women's caloric needs increase and their insulin sensitivity goes down. So very often women find themselves dealing with this increased appetite. They're confused by it. They feel sluggish. They feel lower energy, all normal as part of the infradian rhythm. And so just starting to make some intelligent choices about, loading up on the fiber, on the healthy proteins, on these complex carbohydrates for slow release energy, but also honoring the body's need for more calories, approximately in the 250 calorie range per day, and not fighting that impulse because we're so conditioned to think that less is more when it comes to calorie intake. Really honoring that need and using the smart, correct, nourishing calories. I think that's really important. And then, I think we know that inflammation plays a role in the monthly cycle. Our inflammatory markers are elevated before menstruation. So again, thinking about things like turmeric and ginger, there's actually research that turmeric and ginger and some of the compounds in them, the polyphenols in them, can help with symptoms of PMS that are linked to inflammation. So really bringing those spices into the rotation around that time and just honoring that things are changing. Men apparently have some sort of a cycle too, but obviously it's much more pronounced for women. So really honoring that we're not always the same and paying attention, slowing down, which is something we talked about at the beginning, and really kind of tuning in, leaning into some of those signals, not always deeming them as bad, and just being smart about how we nourish ourselves while paying attention to our calorie needs as the month progresses, I think is really important to think about.
Dr. Yeckel, do you want to chime in or add anything on that one?
Yeah, I mean, this is one area that there's been a fair amount in terms of exercise and in terms of, you know, the ability to store glycogen, and that kind of can change. The substrate patterns change over the month. But, you know, there is a lot, people should realize that there's also a lot of information about this whole area. So it's difficult. There's a huge amount of variability, you know, between women. So it's very, very difficult to study in a smooth way and get definitive results. But that luteal phase that she's talking about, women tend to store glycogen better. So it might be a time when, you know, that they might be able to compete better. It's still pretty sketchy. There just hasn't been as much, you know, good research done in the area, I would say.
I think that's fair, but it's nice to see sort of a start at least. We have talked a lot so far, obviously, about keeping energy up, but that's not always where we want our energy to be. Sometimes we want it to be a little lower, like at the end of the day. And unwinding can be difficult even in the best of times. And right now, with us all having screens and coronavirus and election, it can be really hard to unwind. So Dr. Koya, I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about how what we eat and drink at the end of the day or before we're trying to sleep can impact our ability to relax or impact the quality of our sleep.
Yeah, I love that question. Again, I don't think it's discussed enough. Between sleep and energy is inextricable. There's so much evidence that they are so linked. And I think as a society, we don't emphasize sleep enough. Hopefully that's changing with all these sleep trackers and blue blockers. But, you know, sleep is incredibly important. It's when a lot of really, really critical repair, rest, and rejuvenation processes occur. So one of the things, again, I notice is that, and I think there's data supporting this, you know, through this pandemic and lockdown, alcohol consumption has gone up. You know, understandably so, people need a crutch, people need a coping mechanism. But it turns out that even though there is this term nightcap, unfortunately, the reality from a science perspective is that alcohol disrupts your sleep cycle, especially if it's close to bedtime, even within 3 hours of bedtime. There's, you know, people with sleep trackers will tell you even a single glass of wine will affect the duration of their REM sleep, their deep sleep. So when we start to rely on these crutches on a regular basis, we might get a short-term kind of stress release, short-lived, but we're really affecting our sleep quality, which is then kind of contributing to this vicious cycle of poor energy, more cravings. We know that poor sleep impacts cravings. We know it impacts insulin sensitivity and metabolic health. Yeah. So I really like to, you know, as much as I love a glass of wine, I really like to caution people who are using it routinely and just pay attention to that link between alcohol and sleep. And then another point that we didn't really talk about that I think is really important is this concept of time restricted eating, really syncing up with our circadian rhythm. We talked about the sort of monthly rhythm for women, but we all have a circadian rhythm. It's a 24-hour rhythm. It's influenced by natural light. And, you know, the research is showing that if we can eat in sync with the circadian rhythm, if we can finish eating kind of 3 hours before bedtime in the 7-8 p.m. range, maybe even earlier for some of us, really give our body that time for rest, repair, rejuvenation, digestion, optimal sleep, that can have a huge positive impact on energy as well. So just restricting your eating window to 10 to 12 hours, not necessarily going super aggressive with like the intermittent fasting. If you don't want to do that, even the 10 to 12 hour window and early dinner can be super, super powerful when it comes to sleep quality and energy.
Fantastic. So if we're restricting our eating and now we're stopping several hours before bed, how do we avoid the need for a midnight snack? Are there foods that can help us stay and feel full so that we don't wake up hungry and cranky in the middle of the night?
I'm going to suggest a very ancient spice tea. So it turns out that herbal teas without any calories, water is totally fine in that kind of technically fasting window. So fennel was actually used in the olden days during long fasts, during long religious fasts. And I find that fennel tea, just steeping a few fennel seeds in hot water and sipping that can be really, really helpful to kind of overcome some of those midnight cravings. I mean, eating at midnight on a regular basis is really, really not doing us any favors. So if you need to rely on an herbal tea to get through some of those late night snack cravings, I say go for it. But your body adjusts the more you routinize this time restricted eating, and the more you give yourself the space to digest, eventually start to tap into those glycogen stores the next morning because you've given yourself enough of a rest. Maybe try a fasted workout. If it works for you, you start to get used to it, and those cravings really do go away. But in the short term, herbal teas can be really powerful.
Wonderful. Dr. Yeckel, since you started off our conversation talking about slowing down to help us energize, I'm wondering what your thoughts are on how to best slow down for the sake of slowing down.
Yeah, let me, I just had a comment off of Kanchan's talk right just then. And one of the things I think in terms of the is to slow down from the sense of what you're choosing for dinner. Because we know that if you basically skyrocket your glucose, when it starts to come down, everyone is going to want to eat again, which means that those couple hours later, you're going to want to eat again. People can be blinded and they know exactly when their blood sugar is coming down. So the idea that if you make choices that smooth out your blood sugar, that you're not going to have those appetite cues is a really important aspect if you're going to start to try to introduce this, not even intermittent fasting, but this sort of longer rest digest. So that, to me, that's part of the slow. I think for women, for everybody, it's to start to enjoy food for what it was. Bring your families together, sort of sit down, take a moment, take a breath, laugh over dinner. I think it's the process. As Kanchan said, it's also about, preparing the foods and having them. You could have little contests in the household, buy 5 ingredients, and everybody has to figure out what to make with those 5 ingredients. Kind of go off of the idea that we can start to reintroduce real food, real meals, enriched experiences over food, which we've kind of lost with all this grab and go culture. And sadly, in the pandemics, a lot more has become grab and go. So to me, it's being conscious of it, being mindful of the fact that you can take a few moments for yourself. You can back up, you can breathe, you can just even if it's for a few minutes, it'll probably make a difference in everyone's life.
I love the point you raised there about having fun with this. We've been very serious in our discussion today, but you're right, food and nutrition and a healthy diet can be fun. So I'm glad that you raised that. I am afraid that we've come to the end of our time today. I do want to thank everybody for joining us, and a huge thank you to Dr. Koya and Dr. Yeckel for your insights today. I know that I, for one, will be making some changes based on what I heard. No promises on moving the bread basket to the end of the meal, but I'll think about it. I also want to thank Kuli Kuli and UCAN again for coordinating today's call and making available their energizing products from moringa and super starch that are really easy to add in to a nutritious and delicious diet. So thank you everyone and have a good afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.